Review.
You'll find yourself in plenty of furballs in Tom Clancy's Hawks 2, but they're not your regular icky cat-type furballs. In air combat terms, a furball is a massive aerial dogfight, and the furballs in Hawks 2 are exciting and tense for the most part. But there are faults in Hawks 2 that stop it from reaching the gaming stratosphere, including inconsistent enemy AI and poor collision detection. The first game's original protagonist, Colonel David Crenshaw, mainly takes a back seat this time around to let the focus shift onto 3 new hotshot pilots from the US, UK and Russia. In typical Tom Clancy fashion, the plot is a country-hopping potboiler that mixes in Middle Eastern insurgents, the rapidly becoming a cliché Russian ultra-nationalist forces, and a potentially devastating nuclear threat. The cutscenes and radio chatter that he used to convey the story aren't great, but the eventual narrative payoff is pretty solid. Hawks 2's missions start slowly, with the first few just taking you through the basics of the game's arcade take on air combat. You get to fly 32 different planes from the US, British and Russian forces, including famous ones like the F-22 Raptor, Harriers and several models of MiGs. Although there are subtle differences in speed and maneuverability among planes, they all feel responsive and fly quite well. Novices may take a while to come to grips with the skills required to chase down other planes, but after a few missions you'll be able to hold your own. Enemy planes start off pretty dumb, content to let you get easy missile locks, but the challenge rises significantly in the second half of the game. It's a lot of fun to take on large waves of aerial enemies. A high-speed fly-through of a fireball that was an enemy plane just milliseconds ago is one of the greatest thrills an air combat game can provide, and Hawks 2 provides plenty of those moments. But by the end of the game, the difficulty spikes unevenly. You can be on the tail of a tricky opponent for up to 5 minutes or even longer, with the enemy firing off a seemingly infinite number of flares to throw off your missiles. And because many objectives are time sensitive, having to waste time chasing and gunning down that flare-happy opponent can lead to plenty of failures. Thankfully, the game has a pretty good checkpoint system, so you don't have to retry entire missions from scratch. The game also has poor collision detection. This is particularly apparent when flying in third-person view, as you find yourself in plenty of air crashes after inadvertently flying too close to something when it looked like you had plenty of room. Now normally this wouldn't matter in a high-flying air combat game, but Hawks 2 features several missions where you have to navigate your plane through tight, constricted spaces.
You'll be approaching the city along a narrow winding canyon to the south.
Hawks 2 lets you take off and land in several missions, and the controls for these are pretty easy to get the hang of. If you're having problems with landing, you can use the game's enhanced reality system to help guide you in. While it can be conceptually pleasing to see a mission through from takeoff to landing, it still seems like an odd addition to a game like Hawks 2. If you're an action fan, having to land your plane after just surviving an all-out aerial assault can feel like an anticlimax. Flight sim fans will feel the controls are too simple to be any challenge. The game's other attempts to get you out of the cockpit don't fare well either. Hawks 2 tries to break up the dogfighting action by letting you control unmanned aerial vehicles for surveillance missions, and even gets you behind the turrets of an AC-130. The UAV missions are fairly monotonous. You have to mark buildings, identify targets, and track vehicles to eavesdrop on phone conversation, and it's as exciting as it sounds. The AC-130 is the more fun of the two, if only for the sheer firepower at your disposal, but even this is on rails and requires little more than moving a target reticle around. Hawks 2 fares much better when it sticks to fast-paced hijinks while in the fighter pilot's seat. The missions here feature good variety, so despite some of the problems you'll run across with tricky enemy fighters, flying in a fighter plane rarely gets boring in Hawks 2. Playing through the game's 20 missions takes about 12 hours, but there's some good replay value to be found thanks to an arcade mode that has you replaying through the story missions while meeting specific challenges. There's also a survival mode where you have to fight off waves of enemies, and a free flight mode that lets you fly around the game's large maps without fear of getting into a skirmish. Multiplayer options in Hawks 2 are more robust than in the original. As in the first game, Hawks 2 features drop-in and drop-out co-op for up to 4 players, and you can play through either individual missions, through the entire story campaign, or even on arcade mode levels. Playing through with friends is good fun, particularly during the more intense dogfights. UAV and AC-130 missions are not particularly engaging when done in groups though. When it comes to playing competitively, Hawks 2 offers team battles where opposing planes aren't the only things you'll have to combat. Various targets, some static like satellite installations, and other dangerous ones like naval frigates, populate the playfields and can be destroyed for extra points. Up to 8 players can engage in dogfights, and these matches generally run pretty well online. The game also has its perk systems. As you earn experience points and gain levels by playing the campaign and online, you can unlock new planes and abilities that can be used in competitive matches. Hawks 2 looks best when you're in the air, with the game's use of satellite images making the large areas you're flying in look quite realistic. It's not until you get close to the ground that things start to look decidedly dicey. Flying in any lower than a few hundred meters reveals blocky trees, poorly defined structures, and plenty of low quality textures. The game's cutscenes may not look as bad as the ground in Hawks 2, but they're not great quality either. The planes are deservedly the stars here. They're all rendered in good detail and pleasing to look at in flight. And Hawks 2 only truly shines when it focuses on aerial combat. Imperfect as it might be, there's still plenty of fun to be had in blasting through the skies, in pursuit of your enemies, and getting involved in some serious furballs. Everything else in Hawks 2 just seems like a distraction.
You are the only person who could have warned the Separatists, General. It was a foolish move. I had to improvise.